Those of you who have been fans of my channel, or at least subscribers for a long time, will know that 3 years ago, wow, it's already such a long time, what the hell happened? When Part 5 was airing, we'll know that as an episode of Part 5 came out, I would watch it and I'd sort of analyze it, / just have fun with it, / just sort of revel in the fact that I love this show. I'd watch it frame by frame, sometimes because there was a particular point that I wanted to make about a stand design that you only really saw in a particular frame, or a panel of the manga. Sometimes I'd compare the manga panel to what was being shown in the anime, how it was adapted, what were its strengths as an adaptation, what were its weaknesses. And sometimes I'd watch it frame by frame just because the animation happened to be particularly smooth for a cut or a shot. Sometimes I'd go into more metaphorical language, talking about what does it mean for, Jojo to represent the sun and all this kind of complex, highfalutin ideas that I never really knew where I was going with, but it was always a journey to explore. And I didn't know what to do with that series, but right now, I do know that I want to bring it back. So we're bringing it back, baby. We're bringing it back. And I didn't want to do part 5 again because that would mean either I'd have to start from episode 1 and I didn't want to go through the whole thing again, or I'd have to jump straight into episode 10 or wherever I left off, right? So instead I decided to do part 3, Stardust Crusaders, and this gives me the ability to jump straight from episode 1. It also, I think, part 3 is maybe the falling off point for a lot of potential JoJo fans because they get invested in Jonathan. And then, the ending of part 1 happens. They get invested in Joseph, and this time the ending of part 1 doesn't happen. You expect the adventures of Joseph to continue in a sense, and they do. They do in Stardust Crusaders, but not in the way that you expect. You want a bit more Hamon, you want to see more Zeppelis, you want to see more of that flavor of, excessive, ridiculous, cheesy, manly, bizarre adventures, right? You want to see JoJo's bizarre adventures. You want to see this particular format that JoJo has developed into by the end of part 2. And then part 3 comes along and Jotaro is immensely unlikable at the start and remains, if you don't really understand the character, remains unlikable for the entirety of Stardust Crusaders. Joseph is here, but a lot of his fun is, of course, counterbalanced by the fact of his age, which means not only that the nature of his jokes change, he's not so flirty anymore, but also that he has to take on this more serious, responsible mentor character over Jotaro. And while that is very good character development, it does mean that you lose some of that connection you had with Joseph in part 2. And now there are stands. There are these weird things called stands, which are by far the most interesting sort of magic power system ever created in fiction, right? Like, Brandon Sanderson has nothing on this shit, all right? The Force has nothing on this shit. Even Hunter x Hunter's Nen powers are an excuse to make stands part of that universe. And then you compare those to, the most basic low-level magic systems like superpowers for your average superhero comic, like X-Men or more recently My Hero Academia has gotten popular from the same concept. They become so childish in comparison. The problem, though, is that Araki, of course, hadn't thought of all this when he first created stands. And so the early chapters of Stardust Crusaders don't really communicate how cool stands actually are. And they only really become excellent, really in the last quarter of Stardust Crusaders. So this is, what I want to do with this particular series is that I want to sort of handhold new JoJo fans along Stardust Crusaders and say, look, well, this is what this part is trying to do, and this is why it's still interesting. And this is where, it does have some flaws. And here's how things were changed from the manga to maybe make things a bit more appealing or to speed things up. Right? I want to make this a guided tour of Stardust Crusaders, if you will. I'm not going to say I'm the best tour guide. I'm sure many other people would do a better job than I can. Most of all, Araki himself. How cool would that be if Araki just sat down with every episode of JoJo and just said, I like that, I don't like that. Like a fun podcast, that would be. Someone get on that. Someone who lives in Japan. That's free money right there. So that is the intent behind this series that I want to do. Like I said, I don't know how well I'll do it. Some of the things that I'll be excited about as a JoJo fan will only be appreciable to other JoJo fans, people who have already read the manga, for example. So I'm not saying you have to be new to watch this, or that it'll only be enjoyable if you're new to Stardust Crusaders, but I want to at least make sure that people aren't losing interest in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Stardust Crusaders, just because they lose that investment that they built up from part 2, and then they go, well, I got to part 3, and then I kind of didn't know what to do. I know that I personally felt a lot like that, so I'm hoping to target people like myself at that time period. I want this to be basically a forum for people to talk about where Stardust Crusaders is losing them, or from my side, an argument on why the things that Stardust Crusaders is doing is important and relevant to this franchise, and why it's not just about parts 1 and 2, and it's not just about Hamon, as well as, like I said, a guided history of what these stands mean and a deeper exploration of what some of these ideas are, baked into stands and stand design, etc. It's going to be a ride. It's going to be a ride. I am a bit nervous. I'm a bit scared to get into this because the last time I tried recording this, which was I think episode 10 or episode 11 of Vento Aureo, I had a panic attack. And so I just stopped recording right there halfway through. I pretty much just said, I'm going to take a break. I'll be right back. And then I just stopped recording and I never went back to it. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. And with that out of the way, I don't think I have anything else to say. If you're wondering what's happened in 3 years for me personally, I've had my heart broken. That's about it. So let's jump into the first episode of Stardust Crusaders, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3. The Man Possessed by an Evil Spirit. All right. Immediately with the title, there's there's this misunderstanding about what a stand is that gets communicated to the audience, which is an evil spirit, right? And you never really know whether you want to trust Star Platinum as this alternate ego or deeper will, this manifest soul of Jotaro Kujo. And it's hard to know what Araki really wanted you to get out of this interaction in the jail cell immediately from Star Platinum, and even worse from Jotaro Kujo himself, right? The reason I say that Jotaro is unlikable isn't because he has unlikable traits, but rather he's sort of a blank slate in terms of characterization, There are very blatant traits, I should correct myself, there are very blatant traits that he exhibits early on where he is angry, especially regarding a certain kind of female behavior, let's say. He doesn't like screechy, loud girls, right? He doesn't like cutesy girls. But he loves his mother, even though she is one of that type, if you will. He's very protective of people, but that doesn't mean that he is afraid to harm them. That just means that he knows whom he has to harm. Wow, this is a complicated sentence. Whom he must harm to protect those whom he must protect. What the fuck? So, basically what I mean is, if Dio harms Holly, he's gonna kick Dio's ass. That's basically what I'm trying to get at. Kakyoin harms the school nurse, he's gonna hurt Kakyoin, right? That's a very basic tit-for-tat kind of justice. And really, this informs a lot of Jotaro's character at the start. It's very basic, right? You understand that he's a punk and he's a rebel and he's very ferocious. And this description right at the start of why Jotaro is in jail in the first place. He busted up some guy's balls, literally. You're like, what the hell? This guy's crazy. He's worse than Joseph. That we got to step down in terms of gentlemanliness from Jonathan to Joseph, which if you're a sensible JoJo viewer, or if you're kind of the ideal JoJo viewer, if you will, the kind that Araki expected you to be when he was writing the manga, right? Someone who doesn't know what to expect, which really you should be. If you get into a fandom, well, I'm not going to ramble about that. If you get into a fandom after knowing everything about it, then it's just not fun to watch, But whatever. If you're new to JoJo and you go from Jonathan to Joseph, you immediately feel a kickback. Like, who is this punk? How the hell does he get to carry Jonathan Joestar's legacy, right? But then you understand later how that legacy is carried on. It's not being subverted as people like to do nowadays with their stories. They like subverting expectations. But rather, he's just a different person, and he has the same values, but they're expressed in a different way, in a different time, against and for different people. Jonathan and Joseph are actually really good examples because they both are trying to protect Erina, right? Either directly or indirectly. But to Jonathan, Erina is this sweet young girl who's very, kind and beautiful. And to Joseph, she's this old and cranky grandma who's very strict to him, and obviously he's trying to sort of exert himself a bit more in the world by being a bit more of a rebel, but the end result is still the same, right? They're still trying to protect Erina. We see this in all different sorts of facets, how they dress, their hairstyles, obviously, how they use their hamon, right? That iconic moment where Joseph uses the Coke bottle in order to fizz it up and explode the cap off into a police officer's face. Right? So we get this step down, and we get a further step down when we're going into Jotaro, but again, we get that same continuation of those fundamental values. Though there is a superficial step down, Araki is asking us to look beyond the superficialities of a seemingly degrading culture, if you will. He's basically saying, look, not every single time that we say that society has degraded and, oh, people used to be so much better in the good old days, not every time is that true, because the parts that really matter, the parts that make you a virtuous person, those may be just as present as ever before, in fact, may find themselves to require an even greater violence, thus requiring them to be a different person and to act in a different way than the purely gentlemanly manner that we expected from an older civilization. And the proof of that in part 2 is just how much Joseph requires on being a cheat and being a trickster in order to defeat the Pillar Men in the first place, right? Without which he would definitely have lost like 1,000 times over to all of these superhuman beings, in a way that Jonathan's strength of will and character and generosity of spirit would have never allowed him to succeed. And the proof in part 3, of course we'll be talking about that as we actually get into part 3, and I don't just ramble on and on before I even press play, is this idea that first of all, Jotaro has this evil spirit in the first place, that this manifestation of Jotaro's soul is so violent that even he fails to recognize that this is a part of him, right? He thinks it is something overly aggressive. And in fact, he has to actually rein it back in to say, well, oh, okay, this is a little bit too far against these random thugs who really don't deserve it in the first place, though they have attacked me with weapons, nunchucks and knives, as we hear. The question then is not how a Joestar should behave, but what a Joestar believes, what they hold as their core values. Joestars in this case being a metaphor for anybody who wants to act virtuously, someone who wants to embody justice and truth, right? And especially with Jojo, there is this recurring motif of female characters being the people who drive male figures into doing this, which of course it is the case also in real life that this is what we do. Hence it is that nearly all of the warriors of humanity have all been male, right? Because they're supposed to be protecting the females. And it's only a very recent innovation to include women within militaries in the first place. Kind of self-defeating to put on the front lines those people whom you are most trying to protect. It's kind of like making a bank vault out of jewels. Maybe you want to put the jewels inside the bank vault, not on the outside, you see. But anyway, if you're curious about this idea of how female characters have consistently played this role throughout JoJo, then I'd recommend checking out my Over Heaven audiobook, where it is a topic that comes up over and over again. So yeah, plug. This is all very good discussion that I really should be saving for when we actually get to that point in the anime. But the reason why I'm talking about all this so early is just to temper your guys' expectations, especially the new viewers, about what it means for Jotaro to have this evil spirit. First of all, there is this idea that you're not supposed to go into JoJo with your expectations fully spelled out, right? The story is written so that you're supposed to say, you have no idea what the fuck is going on. What do you mean an evil spirit, right? We're not going, hey, here comes Star Platinum and he's gonna stop the bullet, right? We just don't have that sort of expectation at all. So when we're told that he has an evil spirit, we kind of have to take that at face value, which ultimately leads to the introduction of Joseph and Avdol, who have to explain, hey, this is not, by the way, an actual evil spirit. This is this weird thing called a stand. There are some problems that I do want to talk about regarding introducing stands in this way, by first labeling them an evil spirit, by describing Jotaro as being unable to control it, which this time I will save it for when we get to the anime. But these core ideas I want to talk about very, very early, just to lay the foundation of what I'm going to talk about later. And then, like I said, there's the second idea of introducing Jotaro as this further behavioral step down, if you will, like a worse human being in appearances as he's societally understood, right? Like he's literally in jail at the start, the way his daughter is, incidentally. People don't like him. They want to attack him, and he has to isolate himself from them in jail. Of course, he does this for their protection because he's a Joestar in that way. But it is this difference between appearances and the nature of a person that is being represented by Araki here, the way he first did it when contrasting Joseph with Jonathan at the start of part 2. So, and he plays with this idea over and over again throughout JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, through all of the first 6 parts. Hence, like I said, why Jolene is also in jail at the start of part 6. It's also the same reason why Giorno is in a gang. It's also the same reason why Josuke can't handle anyone making fun of his hair and he beats the shit out of them, right? we realize that each of these Joestars is just the restatement of those core values that Jonathan had, but with a different hairstyle, in a different time, for different people. As if to say that true virtue is timeless, right? And formless, but it does produce the same results every time. Does that, here's the classic question that I always asked like a million times when I was doing the part 5 analyses. Does that all make sense? I hope it does. I hope it does. If it doesn't, of course, you can leave your comments. I don't know if I'm going to make a video responding to the comments like I did 3 years ago. I'd like to, though. I'd like to. So leave your comments all the same. If they're good, then I'll read them. How's that? I'll put it all on you. It's not about me at all. All right. So with that sort of introduction to Jotaro as a character, and about where we are continuing from parts 1 and part 2 into part 3, let's actually press the goddamn play button and enjoy Stardust Crusaders. I have to introduce it again. Episode 1 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. The man possessed by an evil spirit. Ignore this warning. Ignore. Nothing was here. Nothing. Censored. Blank. Forget about it. All right. So all this talk of Jotaro, and of course the show actually starts with the retrieval of Dio, right? The antagonist. And this is really interesting to me about part 3. It's very much a story as much of the antagonist as it is about the protagonists, right? You see this a lot with many different works of fiction, right? People say, especially if you're into writing at all and you've listened to any sort of writing tips or whatever, you'll know that the constant declaration is the protagonist should be the person who wants to do things, who is exerting a force upon the world. What you always see in a story, however, is that it's the antagonist who's usually exerting his force in the world, and the protagonist is, in effect, the antagonist to the antagonist, right? He's not defined by his role alone. He doesn't really want anything in and of himself. He just wants to stop the antagonist, right? The Empire wants to rule over the universe. Luke wants to stop them, right? Voldemort wants to rule the wizarding world, and Harry wants to stop him, right? The protagonist is always defined by his opposal to the antagonist, even though the classic definition, if you will, is that the antagonist is supposed to be preventing the protagonist. Now, if you have a good story, like part 7, for example, what you'll notice is that the antagonist and the protagonist want different things. They're not in opposition with each other for the sake of being in opposition to each other. And the conflict between the two wouldn't have happened at all if the means through which both of these ends are trying to be attained weren't exactly the same, and there's only one of them, right? That's the cool thing about Jesus' corpse. There's only one Jesus. And I could talk more about that, but I'm going to wait until we do the part 7 anime analysis, which is, I realize, got to be like 5 years later or something. But to bring it back to part 3, yes, the story is very much about Dio as well, because he is the only one exerting a force upon the world. Almost immediately as he comes out, he gains his stand, and it's Holly Kujo whose life comes into danger. And so the Stardust Crusaders set out in order to stop Dio. Really their only aim, right, is to antagonize Dio. And in that sense, I think it really is important that it is the retrieval of Dio's coffin that is the beginning of Stardust Crusaders, more than the actual beginning of Stardust Crusaders as it's written in the manga, which we'll talk about when we get there. So yes, it's also very interesting that the very first shot of this is upside down, right? With the sky downwards, right? Because we've talked so much about heaven and hell in my analyses of Over Heaven that it's very portentous, let's say, that the return of Dio literally places heaven below him. Everything is inverted. Everything is unnaturally ordered. If I really wanted to, and I should really, considering the fact that I wanted to talk to new JoJo fans, a lot of people are probably going to say, didn't Irina survive because of this coffin? How the hell did Dio also survive on this coffin? Yeah, that's an ongoing confusion among every JoJo fan ever, so don't you worry your pretty little head about that. It is absolutely the case that there is some weird confusion going on with the coffin there. Over Heaven, which is this novel that I keep trying to plug my audiobook for, has its own explanation for how both Dio and Irina survived using the same coffin, which you can go read, but I recommend you wait until you finish part 6, because Over Heaven has spoilers for part 6. And so yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say with this very, very first scene of Stardust Crusaders. It is funny that these, like, completely random sailors are also ripped as fuck. Like, there's no one in JoJo who is not just completely steroided the hell out. I love it. These clouds are beautiful, by the way. They're very Araki-esque. Araki draws nearly all of his clouds like this. Kimyoda! No shit, man. Fair warning to the people. You do get fatigued with my constant interruptions. No, you do get fatigued with this idea that Dio is just going to keep coming back and back and back and back, right? He's just in Phantom Blood, he came back from death. How many times? Like 3 times or something? You think he dies because the police shot him, and then you think he dies in the fire mansion, and then you think he dies in the castle, and then you think he dies in the boat accidents, the boat explosion. 4 times, actually. So this is his 4th return to life. This guy just will not die, which, to be fair, he is a vampire, so I don't know what you expected. But it does set up this example of like, oh my god, how much can Dio possibly be dragged out in this story? Now, to be fair, this is the end of Dio, right? Stardust Crusaders, like every other good guy versus evil guy story, Dio fucking dies, alright? So that's the end of Dio. It's not the end of Dio as a character, as an entity within the Jojo universe. But we never get the rise of Skywalker. Somehow, Palpatine returned. Right? It's just no more of that. Dio is gone for good at the end of Stardust Crusaders. But I think at this point, one of the things that really made me go, really? Are you kidding me? Okay, I know it's called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I know it's supposed to be a campy, cheesy, lame, ridiculous, over-the-top show, but how can they possibly justify Dio coming back this many times? So that's another thing that is very fatiguing about the start of Stardust Crusaders, where you just don't get a good explanation for how it is Dio got into that coffin. Convenient plot excuse that they just so happened to open the latch after the sun had gone down. You know, it's just too convenient. It's just a little bit too played up. And it's just not very convincing, which you don't really want it to be. You want people to be all in and committed when you're making such drastic changes as introducing stands or whatever, right? Now that I've paused here, have you guys noticed that the diamonds on Dio's coffin are all like, they're not very like well shaped, like they're all different sizes, and I don't know. That looks weird. I've never noticed that before, and now I don't want to. Oh my god, should I talk about Jotaro's father? I don't even know what to say. He exists, and he's a jazz musician, and he's on a world tour. Fuck me, what the hell? I love that so much. It's just such a ridiculous plot point. I think the only way to redeem it would have been if he quit touring in order to go visit his wife, who is dying. They probably don't want to worry him or something. I don't know, what the fuck, man. It's such a weird plot point. He should have been dead, I think. It really should have been a, the curse of the Joestar father dying too early. I know he's not a Joestar, but he is the father of a Joestar, so I don't know. For new people, the reason why they call him Jojo, even though the Jo in Kujo is the second syllable, is because in Japanese you say the last name first. So we call him Jotaro Kujo. In Japanese, he's Kujo Jotaro. So you get Kujo Jotaro. From there, you derive the Jojo, Kujo Jotaro. There we get a bit more insight into the kind of character that Holly is. Obviously spoils Jotaro a lot, is very excitable, is genuinely worried for her son, but in sort of an outrageously naive way that doesn't quite exactly imbue you with the confidence that she knows how to handle a person like Jotaro. And because of that, I think Jotaro has this sort of resistance against her. He's basically saying, look, I don't need your kind of motherly affection. Hence his resistance against women of his age who are like, I guess, girls, I should call them. Girls of his age who are sort of cutesy in that same way. I sympathize with Jotaro on that count. Something cool to notice about these first few episodes of Part 3 is that the budget has skyrocketed since Parts 1 and Part 2. There's a lot more animation in general, but also what animation there is also drawn very well. So for example, you can see with this female character on the left, you'll notice the lines are very thick, right? They're drawn with confident, I think with marker essentially, like thick, bold lines, not with the simple pencil lines that you would normally expect an anime to be drawn in. So obviously they spent a lot of effort on it, they spent a lot of talent on it, they spent a lot of money on it. And you see this especially in the very next, I don't know what to call it, a cut maybe? Shot, I guess? Where you get a CG background and the 2D animation drawn on top of it, which is something that you see a lot in anime nowadays. But in 2014 especially, in sort of the mid-2010s, this was considered still a pretty rich technique, as far as Japanese anime was concerned. Really, the standard for animation in anime is what you really saw in Parts 1 and Part 2, where a lot of the action was communicated through static images and a lot of dialogue. That's sort of the standard for anime. Really, the quality of animation, even just in this past decade, has gone up massively as people have become more comfortable with using digital, sort of led by studios like KyoAni and I was going to say Ubisoft. The guys who made Unlimited Blade Works. Who the hell made Unlimited Blade Works? I have to look this up now. God damn it. UFO Table, there you go. Or UFO Table. I've never learned how to pronounce their name. This is an opportunity to learn. UFO Table. UFO Table. Okay, UFO Table. Right, those guys went completely ham with using CG in their works. They had like more than enough money. KyoAni especially is just so rich from all the successful adaptations they made in the 2000s that they can make stuff like Violet Evergarden, an original anime made for Netflix. They can throw a bunch of money at it and, you know, make it look as beautiful as it does, as bad a show as it is. So, yes, I will casually insult other anime from time to time. But yeah, and you see that with Stardust Crusaders here. Unfortunately, the quality doesn't quite persist for the rest of the show, so it's not as successful as really I would hope it to be. But it is all the same prominence here in this episode, and it's nice to see that, given the chance, David Production wouldn't simplify the style just for the sake of saving a little money, saving on resources. And you see this in the later seasons when the character designs get a lot more complex, especially the shading in part 5, right? They go really ham on that. I think actually to the detriment of the show, right? It becomes so complicated that it becomes difficult to replicate. And the whole point of animation is you want to be able to replicate the previous frame so that you get one contiguous movement as you progress frame by frame. Ooh. Keep punching the mic. But yeah, so to me, this is the first time where JoJo's Bizarre Adventure really said, well, this is what we want the show to look like if we had the opportunity. And they really knock it out of the park. It really does look absolutely great, these first few episodes, where they can completely flex their ability, the resources with the CG, and of course their talent. I mean, this is the jail asset, right? They're never going to visit a jail ever again. They're never going to be able to reuse that CG shot in the background ever again, but they still decided to invest in it, so good for them. Now, to this point earlier where I was talking about how Dio is the beginning of part 3, because he is sort of like the primary antagonist, Araki in the original manga actually doesn't play by those rules. He introduces Jotaro straight up, so he clearly sees Jotaro as the protagonist. But even more than that, he starts off with this. Right, the very first page are these memories of Jotaro. And I think the difference between what Araki is trying to do and what the anime is trying to do is that Araki is trying to give you once again this insight into the Joestar's step-by-step descent, if you will. You know, the way Joseph plays against Jonathan. Araki is once again recalling to that by showing Jotaro as this nice young boy who's very keen on pleasing his mother. And then we actually get to the moment, the revelation, where he says, Yakabashi! We're reliving that moment when we realize, oh, that Joseph is actually a troublemaker, and he's not a good guy the way Jonathan was, right? It's that constant reiteration that the Joestars are not each Jonathan, but there's something deeper within all of them that carries the Joestar spirit. And of course, he makes this explicit later on, I think in this episode, with the presence of the Joestar birthmark. No matter who you are or what time period you're from, you are still marked by these core values that are deeper than you. Who you choose to be or what you can interact with or who you can protect. Rather, it is that desire to protect. The desire for justice and for goodness is summoned from you if you are a Joestar, no matter who you are, no matter who you are. Because of that idea's importance to Araki, that is how Stardust Crusaders starts to him. But because the anime creators have this sort of broader perspective on what JoJo means, they see it as, you know, I sort of described earlier, that it's more about Dio affecting himself into the world. That's really the purpose of Stardust Crusaders. That's where the story first takes root. Because we see it as JoJo fans from that different light, we place a focus on that, as opposed to Araki, who placed the focus immediately on Jotaro. So that's an interesting difference that I wanted to point out, in light of the fact that I've already talked about, the starting of this particular episode. Dawn! I love this so much. Jojo no Kimyō Bouken, Stardust Crusaders. This is something only the established JoJo fans will talk about, but I kind of really like the blue colorization for Jotaro. I don't know why they went with this. The undershirt specifically always bothered me with Jotaro's design, because he's got these really colorful belts, he's got this ostentatious golden chain off of his school uniform, And then his undershirt is just this ugly, like, dark, unsaturated green. Like, I don't know what the hell's going on there. And the fact, of course, of his school uniform being black. Really, I think the reason why they did that is because of his hair color. You know, they wanted to make sure that his hat matched his hair. And if his hat had a different color to his school uniform, it just wouldn't work, right? But that being said, I don't know why they didn't just give him blue hair instead, like sort of a dark blue hair. I think that navy blue that's in the manga, the colored manga, is just so good on him. But I don't know. I've never I've never digged Jotaro's coloration.
俺には悪霊が取り付いている。そいつは俺に何をさせるかわからん。喧嘩の時も俺はその悪霊を必死に止めたんだ。だから俺をこの檻から出すな。
So here Araki's trying to introduce us to the idea of a stand, but he doesn't do it very, very well. Mainly because stands are supposed to be a representation of your will, right? They only manifest because you want them to do something a lot. But what we see here with Jotaro is he's actually finding it difficult to control his stand. Now, obviously, there are some stands, Holly being the prime example, where being unable to control it, you as the owner suffer, right? But that's actually the pattern, right? If you cannot control your stand, this is what we see later on, is either you have the ability to use your stand well, to affect yourself into the world, to manifest your will through the spiritual power, or else when you are shot by the stand arrow, you die, right? That's it. That's what happened to Koichi almost. He failed just about, almost, very close. He failed to use this spiritual power. He didn't know how to control it, and therefore he almost died. It was only the very, very end, and by the intervention of Josuke, that Koichi survived at all. But this idea that you can have a stand that you yourself do not know how to control and that you have to restrain yourself, that's a very weird idea. And furthermore, this idea of an evil spirit, right? Like something is possessing you. That's a very non-stand idea. That's, you're not supposed to recognize the stand as a separate being that is inhabiting your body. It's the Gnostic heresy, that's what it is. As you guys know, I've been very involved in Catholic apologetics. What I've learned is that there are pretty much every single idea you have ever had about what religion means and what God means. Every single one of those have been thought of and either debunked or explicated by people who are much smarter than you and I, and either labeled as a heresy or else has a theological explanation for it. And in this case, this idea that you are only the body, you are only the flesh, and that everything contained in you is only a matter of your cells and your physical being and your DNA. Or if you acknowledge the soul, that the soul is a different thing from your body and not the two of them intertwined within one another. Sort of like if you say a jug of milk, the jug and the milk are two separate things, but it's not a jug of milk without the milk. Then it's just an empty jug. The way the corpse is a soulless body. And it's not a jug of milk if the milk isn't contained within the jug. Then it's just spilt milk, and then you can cry over that, I guess. In just the same way, it's a heresy to believe that the body and the soul are not woven into one another in just the same way. And as far as stands are a physical manifestation of the soul, this idea that you can feel something possessing your soul like an evil spirit is a heresy within the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure understanding of stands. So it's very interesting how Araki this is how he chooses to explain stands in the absolute wrong way, right? You might say, oh, but it's actually genius because now we know what it isn't, right? When it's only Jotaro who's having this confusion, so that when Joseph and Abdul come in and tell him, by the way, that's not an evil spirit, that is a manifestation of your soul, your life power, whatever you want to call it, and therefore you do innately have the ability to control it, and furthermore, it's not only a part of you, but it is the essence of you in its purest form. The ability to educate Jotaro in that misinterpretation also gives us as the viewers the ability to see where you can have misinterpretations with the idea of stands and to acknowledge which ones of them are wrong, which ones are heresies, if we want to continue that metaphor. But what it also does in the first place is, because we have no idea what to expect from stands coming out of Hamon, coming out of the ripple power, as viewers, as completely new viewers, as the ideal viewer, as I called them earlier, we might be tempted to take on Jotaro's perspective on this matter and to sort of say, well, how are we going to deal with this evil spirit? And is this going to take a very occult turn all of a sudden? It wouldn't be that out of the way for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure to go from Aztec super vampires to Japanese occultism. So essentially what I'm saying is you get this introduction to the idea of stands that is completely wrong, and if you're not careful, then it can confuse you very early on what a stand is, because you might be tempted to take some of these elements that Jotaro has presented, like the fact that you can't control them very well, like the fact that it seems to be possessing Jotaro as the gospel truth, if you want, instead of a heresy. And this is furthermore compounded by the fact that a lot of the ways that Joseph explains the stand, and a lot of the initial fights, especially Jotaro's upcoming fight against Avdol, have a lot of weird traits in them, such as Avdol saying, oh, it's a very visible stand, it must be very powerful, right? Never brought up again, never an element of stands ever again. This idea that if you lose your breathing, then your stand power should start dissipating. That too, never brought up again, never made a part of a stand fight ever again. There is still that contradiction that even though you're supposed to have everything about stands explained to you by Joseph and Avdol, they too give out wrong information, so you don't really know what to expect or what exactly these new stand powers are. Like I said with Dio's coffin, you would want the introduction to part 3 to be very, very sound so that people get right on board with all these new things that you're introducing, especially something as complicated, something as interesting as stands. But because there are all these contradictions right from the get-go that confuse you, that make you go, wait, but wasn't he talking, what the, because of that, it's very, very easy to lose a lot of viewers early on. You could retrofit Jotaro's experience because the stand was sort of given to him, neither through a stand arrow nor through a natural affinity for stands, but because of Dio's awakening of the world with Jonathan's body. There was a sort of unnaturalness to how Jotaro obtained his stand. But really, I think that's reaching to justify something that Araki himself didn't understand very well about the nature of stands. This is just evidence to me that Araki still hadn't really figured out what a stand was supposed to be through the early parts of Stardust Crusaders, and I think this is one of the reasons why stands early on are so weak. I don't mean in terms of stand power, I mean in terms of telling a story, right? Like the abilities are lame and the fights are gimmicky, right? They're just not that fun to get into, and it's one of the reasons why the early parts of Stardust Crusaders is really punishing for people who came in from Hamon, where Joseph really needed to be very, very tricky and cunning in order to get one over the Pillar Men. Building off of that confusion, we see that Star Platinum is defined later as having a range of 5 meters, which would not allow him to carry a boombox into the jail cell with him, right? Nor even a copy of Shonen Jump, unless someone brought it within 5 meters of him. Various fan theories or headcanons basically say that because Star Platinum was weaker at the start, that allowed him to have a greater range, and so that allows him to pull things in, be more like Hierophant Green, let's say, who has a range of, I think, 20 meters. But considering we never see Jotaro, or indeed any stand ever, do anything like that ever again, what you're saying is that there was this facet of stand powers that Araki wrote but later decided to change. But if we're believing that, then we might as well say that there was this power that Star Platinum had that allowed him to just sort of grab things from in the building that he was in, and then he decided to just change that. We could say basically anything and then append to the end of it, but Araki decided to change it later because there's pretty much no other explanation that we can give as to why this was in the story. In my opinion, it's just a further example of Araki being confused, let's say, or undefined is probably the better word, about what a stand really is at this point in time. And again, as I said, it punishes him when he starts writing stand battles for real, when all of them are very not interesting at the start. The one thing that I will say for the evil spirit, right, something that I will say it actually allows us to see very well is it introduces us to this idea that Jotaro is someone who really deeply wants to protect other people, to the point that he will isolate himself in a jail cell when he thinks that he is going to harm other people. Of course, he doesn't want to harm other people, which really, if we had a modern, and by we, I mean Araki, if Araki had written stands with the same knowledge of stands that he has now, he wouldn't have had to hide himself off in the first place. He would simply be accustomed to it, right? He'd be able to control it very well. But because we have this idea that stands are something that maybe you don't have the ability to fully control, it gives us this insight into Jotaro that he will sacrifice his own well-being for the sake of others, even if it's people who he doesn't really need to take care of. And in fact, he has reason to hate. The people who are trying to beat him up at the start are described as a former boxer and a bunch of thugs. They're attacking him with nunchucks and knives, and he's completely unarmed. But all the same, he will secret himself away. He will hide himself away in order to prevent their lives from being lost. So we get a really good idea of who Jotaro is as a person, that he cares about people in this way, compared to, for example, the more explicit displays of affection from his mother and from his female fans, classmates. We see from him a much more mature sense of what it means to care for someone else, that you are willing to put your own well-being lower on the priority than theirs, right? That you are willing to live in this kind of cramped jail cell for the sake of other people. We get that much characterization for Jotaro, at least from this misconception of Star Platinum as an evil spirit. Oh, look at that beautiful animation. Jotaro, even just Jotaro stepping out of bed, it's just so smooth. And then we get stuff like this, where it's actually animated almost at 24 frames per second, right? Like they're going full frame, instead of the usual 8 frames per second you get for anime. Anyway, so for everything I've said about Araki getting this introduction of the basic concepts of stands wrong, quote unquote, we do have a perfect reveal of Star Platinum here. It's amazing in the manga. It's very, very well done here in the anime as well. Basically showing you, by the way, this thing totally exists. This is also one of the few times where Jotaro isn't wearing his hat, so enjoy it while you can. This panel is pretty much traced directly from the manga. The pose is beautiful, especially of his left hand there? Yeah, his left hand there. It's everything you need. In fact, they give a little extra twist to the pinky, which isn't even in the original manga. And of course, you get this iconic moment where Star Platinum casually just snatches the bullet in midair, just stops it, just like, how about no? And in my opinion, this is really where, forget all the other stuff about the evil spirit. This, in my opinion, is a much better introduction to stands compared to everything that we've talked about previously, everything that Jotaro has been saying about trying to stop this thing. It should be, look what I can do with my new power, right? It should be something that Jotaro can consciously do instead of something that he is sort of accidentally witness to or the host of. This looks gorgeous, by the way. What a beautiful frame, isn't it? The smoking bullet, the smoky hands, beautifully drawn, beautifully shaped. The manga panel is also just one of the most beautiful frames ever, especially colored with that beautiful, shimmering, radiant purple of the original manga. Beautiful. I have been rambling for an hour, which normally is par for the course. We're only 7 minutes in. But I did want these new episodes, considering the panic attack and all that, I did want these episodes to be only about 30 minutes long each, which means I'm not going to go an episode at a time anymore. Instead, I'm going to go just as much as I can analyze in 30 minutes. Something else I noticed about my recordings of these 3 years ago was that I would only ever use about half of what I said. So if I want these episodes to be 30 minutes long, then I'd have to stop talking at the hour-long mark, and I have just crossed the hour-long mark, so I am going to stop talking here just as we get the logo for the ad break, I suppose. I don't really know if you guys will like this or not. I know you guys were really into my ramblings 3 years ago. I don't know if the people watching my channel have changed. I don't know if your guys' tastes have changed. I don't know if you guys were only interested because it was Vento Audio and that was airing at the time. I don't know any of these things, and worst of all, I don't know if you guys will be interested in this series at all, if you guys will like what I've recorded here at all. I hope you do. And either way, tell me in the comments what I could improve, what you want to see more of, what I could maybe stop talking about because it was boring or whatever, where you think I said something wrong, or the things that I said that you agree with. All of those things, I'm very, very keen on reading your comments. Like I said, if they're good, then I might dedicate a whole video to them. But for now, I am going to end it here. Stay mortal. Don't be jump scared by death. Don't indulge in heresies. And the Jojo quote of the day is, Yakabashi!